we're still continuing this antebellum life here. So we want to focus on slave markets for this moment. Hopefully, this one will be a little bit shorter. We know that the international slave trade was outlawed in 1808, and then with the Compromise of 1850, the domestic slave trade within Washington, D.C. was outlawed. But aside from those, the domestic internal slave trade within the United States was in full function until probably the end of the Civil War. I don't think people were really buying and selling much during the war because there wasn't a lot to buy and sell. But up until that point, there was nothing illegal on the books about domestic slave trade. And then when the Confederate States leave, it doesn't matter what's on the books in the US because they're their own country. But we really do want to talk about the slave market because these are just as horrendous as life on the fields. I mean, there's nothing good about enslavement. There's no part of enslaved life that's good. So let's just clear that up. They're all horrendous. These slave markets are later on, especially in the Deep South, for the cotton fields, right? You need more people to harvest the cotton. The more cotton you have, the more people you need to do the work. And so again, we know that the international slave trade has been banned for many years. But we also know that people don't really follow the law, right? So a lot of smugglers would illegally transfer people through Florida and Texas or Cuba and still bring people in. But the largest number of enslaved people after 1808 came from the people of the upper southern states selling down to the lower south, which is part of the phrase down the river, right? We know we've got that trail down the Mississippi River, and you are selling your property under Dred Scott down the river for some sort of profit. Domestic slave trade is as horrible as international slave trade. You're not dying in the Middle Passage anymore. Instead, you're being split up at your home, but you're not home. Families are split up. We know that. A lot of times they're sold off to super far apart plantations, never to be seen or heard from again. And again, we talked about how they had paired people to ensure a better population. And they would take these people to markets and put them on display to convince other people to buy them. It's like putting a car on display or a horse and saying, hey, look at this. Here's what you can get for it. Here's what I want. Here's what I want for it. An enslaved man has recounted for us the horror of being an enslaved woman. His name is William J. Anderson. He says, he divested a poor female slave of all wearing apparel, tied her down to stakes, and whipped her with a handsaw until he broke it over her naked body. In process of time, he ravished her person and became the father of a child by her. Besides, he always kept a colored miss in the house with him. This is another curse of slavery, concubinage and illegitimate connections, which is carried on to an alarming extent in the far south. A poor slave man who lives close by his wife is permitted to visit her, but very seldom. And other men, both white and colored, cohabitate with her. It is undoubtedly the worst place of incest and bigamy in the world. A white man thinks nothing of putting a colored man out to carry the 4-row and carry on the same sport with the colored man's wife at the same time. So he's talking about a master, not himself, right? And again, selling these people is a key part of this agrarian Southern economy. And this is part of that sectionalism we keep talking about. The economy in the North is not reliant on selling and buying people. Yes, it is reliant on immigrant labor. And technically, you could argue that capitalism is selling people or buying people, but it's not quite the same. They still have the illusion of freedom and free choice, right? And what is freedom except having the illusion that you have the ability to decide for yourself? And enslaved people do not have that. So, this is a major part of their economy, and white men carefully consider the investments and the return on investment when they're dealing with buying and selling. And the second Middle Passage becomes what the slave markets are known for. This is where they see over 1 million or more captives sold in the domestic slave trade from 1820 to 1860. It's only 40 years. That's a lot of people to buy and sell. Groups are usually transported together to places like Virginia, where they specialize in raising people to sell. And to New Orleans, where they were often sold to planters in the Mississippi Valley. And New Orleans had the biggest, largest slave market in the United States before the Civil War. The trade makes rich planters even richer. Again, that 72% that doesn't own slaves isn't dealing in this. And really, even the ones that do, the ones that own 1 to 10, probably don't have enough money to go and buy enslaved people, but is making those elite planters a lot richer. A healthy young male around the 1820s, 1860s could be sold for about $1,000, which is approximately $30,000 in 2014 dollars, which means it's probably even more today. So if you sell just 10 enslaved people, you are going to be rich. And obviously, the rich get richer. So by the 1850s, when demand for enslaved people reached its peak, the prices had doubled. A person who would have sold for $400 in 1820 is selling for at least $800 by 1850. And this actually leads to the concept of like, let's reopen the international slave trade, because it's costing them a lot of money to buy their own people. And even if you want to increase it, it takes a while. You cannot, no matter how badly you want to, you cannot force a baby to work. You have to wait a few years to get that baby to move it and be able to be efficient. So we don't have this ability to just, spawn right there. We don't spawn into adulthood. You have to go through childhood first. And yes, they put the children to work, but it's still going to take a while if you want those field hand and those planters. So they start to demand to reopen the international slave trade, which is going to cause a rift between the upper and the lower South, because then the upper South also starts to get worried that that's going to lower their prices and hurt their profits. So there's sectionalism everywhere now. We've got sectionalism between the North and the South. We've got sectionalism between the North and the West. We've got sectionalism between the upper South and the lower South. And realistically, when we look at all of these trends, somebody would have had to do a lot to fix all of this. And we know by now they didn't. And so we are looking forward to the inevitable, maybe, breakup of this country.